Well, good afternoon, everybody. I know that it's a little early yet for the start of today's webinar. We are working through assurances that this time around I will be able to see and respond to your questions. We will be starting the presentation promptly at 1 o'clock. Thank you for those of you, some 20 or so, that are already on board for today's webinar. We look forward to sharing the latest information with you. We will do the normal and obligatory do's and don'ts as we get a little closer to the start of today's call, and we will go from there. Thank you for all that have already joined in. We welcome you, and we will join you again shortly. It helps if I take it off mute. Welcome. We're about 10 minutes before the start of today's webinar and the continuation of discussion that CSPEN has regarding the CARES Act and the latest information being shared from various sources, including the Department of Education, Capitol Hill, and throughout the community, amongst and between state associations, national organizations, and the like. We will be starting right in on the hour. Maybe a minute or two afterwards. Welcome the 75 to 80 of you that have joined in and the registrations of over 300 to 400 that we have for today's webinar. We will get started with a couple of the do's and don'ts. For those of you who were on Tuesday's webinar, I can assure you we have the questions taken care of, so I can see them this time and be able to try and respond to some of those. Sorry for my inability to understand the actual utilization of all the resources on our first run through on Tuesday, but we've got that all sorted out. So give us another 10 minutes or so and we will get started. I'm going to put you back on mute and look forward to joining you again in just a few minutes. Okay, we're about 5 minutes away from the start. Once again, continue to welcome all of you who are joining today's CSPEN webinar. We'll get started in about another 5 minutes. We welcome the continued growing number of registrants who are actually signing in as we speak. We'll get started in 5 minutes. A couple of the do's and don'ts now, and then I'll refresh them right before we start. We do have the opportunity for you to provide questions and also chat for us. Both of those functions are available on your drop-down menu to the right-hand side. I will try to review those at certain portions throughout this particular webinar and presentation, normally at the end. We have built in a number of the questions that were received from Tuesday's webinar into the actual presentation today, and we'll try and go through some of those as a portion of today's presentation, both from the standpoint of the questions that were asked and new guidance that was posted by the Department of Education yesterday on April 1st. Definitely some things that were helpful in terms of some of the guidance that we can glean from what they shared, not only with the servicers and the lender community, but placed it on the student, borrower, and institutional portion of their COVID website. We'll get started here once again in about another 3 minutes. Welcome all of you that are joining, and talk to you in a minute. Well, good morning or afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's CSPEN webinar, the CARES Act, and our latest summary and analysis of all the information that we have available to us at this particular point in time. We want to thank the over 250 to 300 registrants that are currently attending today's webinar. This is a continuation of a series that we will probably continue not only this week, but in the weeks to come in order to share the most recent information and guidance from the various different resources as we all work through these challenging times of the COVID virus and also the significant changes that it has brought about with regard to higher education. What we hope to provide to you today is a continuation and, as I said, an update on new information that has been provided over the last 48 hours. Not surprisingly, there is a great deal of effort on the part of the department as well as the community to continue to try and work through the questions and answers and the ability to move forward. As we go through things today, similar to the presentation on Tuesday, the basic outline is an overview. It'll be very short and brief. Then we'll get into more of the details on the student benefits provided through the CARES Act. We incorporated some of the questions that you asked on Tuesday's email, some of which we could answer, and quite honestly, a number of them which are still pending our ability to work through the devil of the details and make sure that the information that we provide to you is accurate and sourceable back to the department, NASFA, other organizations, as we all try again to make sure that we're compliant with the regulations and the statute as they come forward. Similar, we will look at borrower support and a significant number of changes that have come forward with regard to new information from the department on how the lenders and servicers and private collection agencies, among others, are to do their job on the back end. And in providing some of that information, it also lends itself to additional information for the front end, meaning the schools and the students as well, all of which was posted yesterday by the department on the COVID website, and then specific information added to a number of the Q&As there. We'll then talk a little bit about institutional relief and support, the three areas of the CARES Act, one dealing with policy, another with appropriations and the funding mechanisms for institutions of higher education, a third being the opportunity for potentially for institutions to also look at whether or not they want to pursue and have access to loans in the form of assistance to help once again try and maintain your employees and your level of activity and sustain as much of the past or the present as possible as it was prior to the start of the pandemic. So without further ado, there's just a quick browser shot of the actual act. It is, as I think everybody knows by now, the Coronavirus Relief and Economic Security Act of 2020, or the CARES Act. By way of a very, very brief overview, this is the third in a series of pieces of legislation that Congress has put forward since the start and the outset of the pandemic. The first two focus primarily and almost exclusively on ways in which to focus on help for health services and the Department of Health and Human Services in the actual efforts to ramp up to get to the point of the ability to have access to the testing for the COVID virus, as well as the various different means to try and ramp up for the anticipated and now reality of the number of individuals that are unfortunately going to our hospitals and to the makeshift hospitals as our frontline individuals try to continue to provide healthcare services to all of the individuals that have caught the virus and are seeking help and resort. The third, CARES Act, was the first that really focused on any modifications or information for higher education policy, and it did include quite a number of provisions. Several of the sections of the bill, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, are portions of the $2.2 trillion in funding that are intended to be as a stimulus to, again, try and keep the economy from falling deeper into a recession that has already been recognized and announced, but trying to do everything that can be done to support the continuation of business as usual, recognizing that everything right now is anything but usual. Going forward, we will look back first at the dates very quickly. The Senate passed the CARES Act on Tuesday, March 25th, and then it was followed by the conclusion of House passage by voice vote on that Friday, the March 27th, and signed by the President late that afternoon. This is a unique indication that shows that once again, Congress can move swiftly, especially in times of emergency, to work towards getting things done for the populace. And certainly, while the first two and now this third piece of legislation is vastly needed and working its way towards implementation, we do anticipate that there will be additional actions taken by Congress as well as by the Department of Education and potentially even the administration and President Trump through additional executive orders as need be. Starting first with the student benefits, the name of this particular picture is called Frozen in Time. I think it's kind of appropriate because in a lot of respects, what has been proposed in the CARES Act and by the Department of Education and Administration attempts to freeze both some of the student benefits as well as the borrower relief in time for periods of time, many of which are fully defined and others which we're still waiting on definitive word on what the time frames for. But let's start with the student benefits first. The CARES Act contains two specific provisions that are very helpful for students in terms of their overall eligibility for lifetime learning in terms of both their federal Pell as well as their loans, from protections from in the event that an individual were to withdraw, that the funds for this payment period of enrollment or term will not count against those individuals as a portion of their overall calculation of lifetime eligibility. These are important for students, obviously, that are withdrawing during the pandemic. They tie very nicely into a lot of the information that has been provided by the Department of Education, first in their March 5th initial guidance, providing information on how institutions and students were to be looked upon if they were withdrawing based on their catching of the virus, the need to service another individual in the family or friend that has the virus, or whether or not other circumstances arose that caused them to have to withdraw. Similarly, discussions around the ability for individuals to try and make the leap from bricks and mortar circumstances to online education, some of whom just simply aren't going to have the ability to do that. Maybe with the additional funding that is coming forward that we'll talk about later in terms of the emergency stabilization funds and the higher education emergency relief funds, we can help soothe the path back or potentially protect more individuals from having to withdraw. But the good news is, one of several pieces of good news for the student's perspective, is neither their Pell nor their loan eligibility in the context of lifetime eligibility will be impacted by their withdrawal if they do so during the pandemic and during the periods related to the national emergency. One of the questions that was received with regard to this particular set of circumstances was whether or not and how it related to, actually that goes one slide further, so we'll go, they're out of order. We'll go here to the next set of student benefits, which were in fact the fact that the institution and the students, particularly the students in this case, but we'll talk about the institutions later, are eligible to retain all of the funds for the payment period or period of enrollment, even if they withdraw. Something different than the norm. Normally, we would have to return to calculate an R2T4 fund calculation for that individual and return the funds back to the lender or to the Department of Education. But given the extenuating circumstances surrounding the pandemic, the department has seen fit, and the CARES Act and Congress has put forward new guidelines that state that individuals are allowed to retain those funds. Now, from an institutional perspective, you still have to calculate the R2T4 determination, not because you're going to refund those monies back to their respective places, but in order to be able to fulfill a requirement in the CARES Act that calls for the ability for the institutions to report to the secretary the amount and the amount of funds from those various portions of students that withdrew that were still maintained by the student and not returned to the federal coffers or to the lenders to bring down the loan balances. The CARES Act also includes specific language around leave of absences. As we all know, the 180-day limit on LOAs requires that an individual that stops out and is granted a leave of absence under the existing regulations is required to return at the point at which they left. Under the congressional changes that are being provided for just during the period of the pandemic, the opportunity for those students to not have to return exactly where they left off is being provided. So a waiver that, again, help students so that they can return to school sooner than potentially having to wait for the cyclical and cyclic process to be able to come back in at the point at which they left off. And we'll talk about it from an institutional standpoint a little bit later, along with some questions that have been provided there on terms of the 180-day window and a couple of other things. Last but not least, from the student's perspective, when it comes to, and again, students who have withdrawn or dropped out, all of these provisions under the CARES student benefits focus on individuals that are departing the institution and recognizing that there are going to likely be a number of departures as a result, unfortunately, of the pandemic. In the event that a student were to withdraw, the satisfactory academic progress waivers that are provided in the CARES Act also contemplate the ability for the institution, recognizing the potential need and the rationale for students to have departed, to not necessarily apply the grades or the calculation of determinations in the satisfactory academic progress of the student as it relates to the periods and after, around the departure and the payment period or period enrollment of the existing term. The goal here, once again, I think if you can read very clearly, the intent of Congress is to protect to the greatest degree possible the students from having any harm done to them or any negative consequences arise for them as a result of their unfortunate need to depart from your institution, again, recognizing that that departure was as a result of something related to the emergency pandemic and corona. There are a couple of other provisions that again help the students, these not as reflective in our community, but nevertheless important for students and those attending other portions of the higher education community with regard to the National Service Corps, but also it does make sure that in the event that the programs are suspended, the individuals still receive access to their grant assistance under that program. Similarly, for teachers, in the event that they aren't able to complete or are having to have left their circumstances at the elementary and secondary level as they're going through potentially their teaching assignments and the like, the individuals are eligible to keep their grant assistance under the teach grants, even though they are no longer necessarily fulfilling those requirements if they, in an actual institutional setting. They may still be doing, I've heard from a number of people, electronically as we all look and are all in the virtual world and the distance education and online world, but a number of elementary and secondary institutions also have been having such a time converting to online and the different modalities that a lot of the students unfortunately have been pushed to the side. Regardless, those students will still be protected with regard to receipt of their grant assistance for the current payment period or period of enrollment, and that also have that period recognized for purposes of teacher loan forgiveness. Secondarily, and one of the ones that I like a lot is the slide that shows the piggy bank with the individual with the mask over it. These are the borrower benefits, and we're going to talk in greater detail about those and some new information that came forward by the department. The first of two major borrower benefits in the CARES Act deals with the employers and the ability for employers to, as part of a potential tax break for them, look at the number of employees that they have within the entity that have student loans. And if they so choose, they can provide up to $5,250 in payment on behalf of those borrowers, and in so doing, get the tax break that comes with however much of an amount they've put forward on behalf of the students. This coincides with the ability for the borrowers to have the benefits we'll talk about here in a second. What is interesting is that this particular tax provision is on a different timetable than the provisions we'll talk about in just a second for the student borrower themselves. Under this particular provision, the employer has not only from March through September, as is granted to the borrower, but literally all the way through January 1st of 2021 to take advantage of the opportunity to potentially pursue these tax breaks, which means that as we talk in just a minute about what the benefits are for the borrower, we could see additional reductions in the overall amount of interest and accruing and or principal for students based on whether or not the employers choose to take advantage of this new tax break provided to them from now through the end of the current calendar year. For the students, the thing you've probably heard the most about, and certainly the part that the media has spent the vast majority of their time focused on, are the key issues related to the ability for, again, a freeze or a stopping of any of the requirements around student loan repayment. The good news here is that not only does the CARES Act bring forward, as the president did, a notion of no accrual of interest during the period of time, this basically stops and makes all payments similar to as if they were being paid, even though they aren't, for a period between March 13th and September 30th, 2020. Those dates are significant because they parallel the information and guidance that was previously provided by the Department of Education, first in their March 13th, then in their March 20th information on the student loan borrowers. That information has recently been updated, and here is some of the new information literally posted by the Department of Education just yesterday. As you can see, when it talks about and provides additional information around the 0% interest payment period and the no accrual of interest, one of the key points that everybody needs to be aware of is that this benefit for borrowers is only for borrowers for programs that are controlled by the Department of Education. So it is only for federal direct student loan programs and FFELP program funds that are controlled by the department. Unfortunately, it does not include FFELP programs, old loans that are outside of it, or Perkins loans, which are both fall, as well as student or private loans, which all fall outside of the parameters of the CARES Act. Similarly, a question that I've received quite often is whether or not Parent Plus loans are included, and to the best of my knowledge, and based on all information and insights and follow-up with the Hill, the answer to that, unfortunately, is currently no. That the only funds that are eligible for this relief and this support are individual borrowers, and those that are individual borrowers that have loans through direct loans or FFELP that are controlled by the Department of Education. As you can see here, once again, it outlines those. If the Perkins loan or the FFELP loans are controlled by the department, they're included, but if not, they are not. Another set of questions that the department released just yesterday are around forbearance. Again, you will see the timelines here of March 13th through September 30th, but it speaks to the fact that all loans, whether they're in forbearance, whether they were in the delinquency period under cohort default rate, under potential cohort default rate data, or in IBR status, all loans are put forward as being in repayment during this period, and it will be paid for by the department, not by the individual. A number of other questions are, once again, will this count towards public service loan forgiveness, teacher loan forgiveness, and a number of the other requirements and/or requirements of an individual seeking to come off of forbearance? The answer to all of those is fortunately yes. So these individuals are getting the full benefit and range of benefits associated with the payments over the next 6 months, irregardless of the fact that they are not in fact paying them down themselves. There is certainly much more guidance that is included in the information that the department has put forward. A brief showing of that is here is a copy of the actual talking points submitted by the department to the lenders and servicers. We will share this with you on CSPEN's website so that you can see this additional information, including a portion of it that was drawn down by the department, question that was previously answered, but they actually are looking at it in greater detail. So they refined it and sent it back to the lenders and servicers as still in progress. But nevertheless, it shows you that the department is working very, very vigilantly on attempting to provide information across the full spectrum, not only for us as institutions and our students, but also for the administrators and other facets of the department and of the administration of the direct loan program. Moving on to the institutional relief, when I did this first on Tuesday, I used this as a slide to show that is the chapel at Wake Forest, where my daughter is currently attending. If you saw the widened panned out shot of that, it shows the campus grounds and basically their empty plaza, where all the students would normally be walking across the plaza from the various institutions that align down either side with the chapel at one end. Obviously now that is not the case. The picture on the right-hand side is my daughter, who is now one of the plethora of students across the country in our sector and others that are now focused on online education. That particular picture was taken when she was taking a Spanish test about 2 days ago. She, like so many of our students, are now all focused on ways in which they are using and being engaged in education from a number of different modalities from institutions in an online or virtual environment. Wake has gone pretty much entirely online. Your institutions may use any one of a number of different capabilities that are out there and have been provided by your various third-party servicers, some of it being direct distance education, others being packets of information shared and sent to individuals to be able to utilize and or a number of other ways. Nevertheless, moving forward, in talking about the issues related to institutional relief, the first of the three in sequential order that were of major importance are issues related to the ability for waivers of some of the basic portions of some of the grant assistance programs, waivers for campus-based aid programs, including federal work study and SEOG. We'll get to a couple of the questions. I'll have to scroll back up because they went out of order for some reason. Then the opportunity to utilize funds from SEOG for different purposes, and also some specific requirements around federal work study. So going back up, this was one of the first questions that I received with regard to federal work study. Individuals who saw the information that CSPEN prepared and sent out, which broke down all of the various different higher ed sections of the CARES Act into layman's language in Word documents where you could read it easier than in the construction as it is provided for in the statute, had questions about words that they saw at the end of a particular sentence with regard to campus-based aid and the notion of a for-profit organization. Given our sensitivity, you can imagine a lot of individuals, as this particular individual did on Tuesday, asking whether or not that exception, which basically the language in that final sentence says in part what you see quoted here, that the awards were eligible for all with the exception of private nonprofit organizations, and thought and questioned whether or not that prohibited our inclusion. The devil, as we always say, is in the details, and in looking at the language itself, specifically in the statute, Section 443C deals specifically with private sector employer agreements, and subclause 3 within that dealt specifically with the matching requirements, the non-federal share that the employers are supposed to contribute as a portion of federal work study. So the short answer to the question is, our institutions are still and have been, as part of the CARES Act, eligible for the waivers granted of the matching funds, both under SEOG and federal work study, and the confusion around this potential caveat is not warranted and fortunately does not preclude our participation. Another question that was asked, which was I don't have an answer for yet, but I hope to soon, is with regard to the 25% waiver of the SEOG, what time period and what portions of SEOG funds is an institution allowed to utilize for purposes of these transitions and the ways that the CARES Act has been modified, i.e. can we go back and can they go back and use portions of their 2019-2020 awards as well as their 2021 awards. The question was asked 2 different times. I've asked that of the Department of Education, submitted it under the COVID request for Q&A, and submitted it to some colleagues into the department. And like several other questions, I'm awaiting hopefully some comment and some feedback from them. I believe that the answer is probably going to be unfortunately no. My gut tells me that once again, all of the intent of the CARES Act is around the funds that and the onset of the national emergency with COVID, and looks at this from that snapshot in time forward. I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that. But again, as I look at the statute, I look at the intent from Congress, and I look at the way in which both the CARES Act is structured and the timelines, again, put forward by the department and all of their guidance from March 5th, March 13th, March 20th, and so on. I'm led to believe, or my gut leads me to believe, that unfortunately you may not be able to take those 1920 funds and move them forward. Speaking with forked tongue, you could certainly make the argument in the case that the ability to do so with those funds would be to the benefit of the students and would provide additional opportunities in times when certainly the individuals are under duress and could utilize those funds, not unlike the funds that are being provided under the emergency stabilization funds, to help provide more to students who are going to need it in order to meet the cost of attendance for the institution. But simply right now, I don't know a definitive answer, and have just shared with you a little bit of the pro and cons, or both sides of that particular question as I see it right now. Moving back through to where the information was before. There you go. It was there. I just did it twice. Moving on to the federal work study side, there were a number of questions directly around federal work study. One of the questions you see here is not unlike the SEOG question, but different but similar. The institution has funds in terms of additional monies from federal work study contributions, specifically the funds that are to be used for community service. Obviously, right now, the ability to utilize and to put individuals into community service type programs is probably non-existent, or if it is existent, it's probably in very creative ways. So the question became, what can we do with those funds? Do we have to keep them under federal work study? Can we convert them over and use them, again, as another portion of SEOG funds or other forms of funding? And if so, what would that look like? Again, while there is guidance that has been put forward by the department in their March 5th and March 20th FAQ, and the original guidance on March 5th with regard to federal work study programs and some significant information in those areas, it doesn't provide an answer to this particular question yet. So again, it's one of the ones that we have submitted and are hoping to hear comment back from key top-level officials in the department, and also potentially in the form of additional guidance that could be forthcoming from the department. I'll talk about some of the speculation and the rumors at the very end in terms of timing going forward, and some things that we're waiting on and might see maybe before week's end, or certainly in days and weeks to come. Moving on once again to a refresher of Section 3508 from the institutional perspective. We talked about the R2T4 funds from the student's perspective and briefly touched on from the institution's perspective, and did the same with leave of absence to kind of be somewhat redundant, but to answer the questions that were asked and posed on Tuesday that we can answer, or attempt at least to answer. How would you validate, or what would be the ability to justify the reasons for withdrawal that was based on COVID, and any idea on what the documentation would look like? As you can see here, we once again note that the department noted below that the CARES Act is, that the way in which this is constructed, that the best thing to look at first and foremost is the opportunity to follow the guidance in the March 5th and March 20th information from the department. We do have concerns, and I will say that one of the things that I think institutions need to be very careful of, especially early on in this process, is a determination of when you start to be able to link R2T4 and the lack of a calculation to the students, and therefore the calculation and the report to be maintained but not brought forward. You do have some guidelines and parameters there because it talks about for the current payment period or period of enrollment for the students or the protected funds. So you need to look at how you're going to address those circumstances as things go forward. But again, be very careful and certainly very wise and prudent as you go forward. Again, based on the information provided by the department, there are a number of areas where I think you're pretty capable of notifying and validating or verifying that the student did depart as a result of COVID. A number of those are here, and those are taken basically just not verbatim, but a paraphrasing in my way of stating a number of things that are already in the March 5th and March 20th guidance from the department. Again, when all else fails, rely on the department's guidance and document. I do think that the ability to document what these circumstances are, the better you're going to be. There were questions and the like that I didn't put here about, well, Tom, what happens or how if we have an individual that departs and we can't get a hold of them? Certainly, I would think and encourage you to do the best you can to make sure that you try and get a hold of individuals and see what information you can provide. Similar to leave of absences in the guidance provided by the department under LOA that we'll talk about in just a second, there is the ability and the authority for LOAs to be granted after the individual has actually left. There may be some latitude given with regard to tracking an individual down and getting the verification on R2T4 after the fact as well. I think that, again, it's just incumbent and inherent upon us to do everything we can, as I know you are, to stay in contact with all your students and do the best you can for when they do have to depart, unfortunately, finding ways in which to make sure that that is done. Last but not least, this is what I provided on the previous slide is by no means an exhausted list. We highly recommend that you look towards other entities to continue to shape your guidance and your decision making. Caveat I should have made at the front, but I'll make here and again at the end is that all of the information we provided to you here is sourced. We can source it back to the department, NASFA, ACE, NICU, or others, and by that you'll see some of what I mean by that with information yet to come. But the determinations and decisions that ultimately have to be made, you need to make with your various third-party providers, your counsel and attorneys, and the higher-ups within your institution. We at CSPEN do the best we can to try and provide you with timely, accurate, and sourced information to help you make those decisions and comply. But as always is the case, the determination, and as you know, the liability based on those determinations resides with you all. Shifting to LOAs, please confirm, the question was, please confirm that the 180-day window was removed or waived as a part of the changes in the CARES Act. The answer to that is no. Unfortunately, the way in which the CARES Act and the language is put forward thus far, it does not address and therefore does not provide for any modification of the 180-day window. In fact, the department has made clear that the 180-day window is still in effect, and at the point at which an individual were to meet and then therefore exceed the 180 days, the individual would have to be terminated. They give specific circumstances on how to address that in the guidance on March 5th and then again on March 20th. So please, again, refer to that information. But for now, there is not an extension beyond the 180 days for LOAs. Interestingly enough, this is one of the areas among many where we believe that the department, as well as Congress, may look to provide additional modifications or latitude in the event that the virus and the pandemic, unfortunately, goes on longer. But we will have to wait and see how that all plays out and whether or not it would be the Congress or the department that would take such action. If it's Congress, it would be in the form of what they're already alluding to would be the phase 4 legislation. And again, we'll talk about that at the end. If it were the department, it would have to come in the form of an executive order because that is a statutory requirement, and therefore I'm not even sure if they can do it without congressional approval. Other portions that are contained within the CARE Act, again, not as reflective of our community, but nevertheless important, are definitional changes and guidance for foreign institutions and for HBCUs and minority serving institutions. The next provision is one that we've highlighted within CSPEN for quite some time. It is the unfortunate change that was made throughout the course of the negotiations between between the Senate Republicans' initial CARES Act that was introduced Friday 2.5 weeks ago. The provisions that were included there provided much broader authority for the Secretary of Education to make modifications and waivers to statute for not only elementary and secondary education, but also for higher education and Carl D. Perkins, so the career and technical education. It is my understanding that throughout the course of the negotiations, and you'll recall that CSPEN reported on the fact that having seen the Senate Republicans bill over the weekend, 2 weekends ago, the Democrats in the House and in the Senate not only made up their own, constructed their own statutory proposals in the House, but sought with the leadership of the White House and the Senate and the House compromises on the Senate Republicans' original bill. As those negotiations moved forward, and candidly, because there were so many provisions in the CARES Act that are targeted towards higher education, and some concerns among Democrats over the ability of the authority to be extended to the Secretary on higher education, given Democrats' frustrations with the borrower defense to repayment regulations, the gainful employment regulations, the as yet unpublished but still noticed and pending final regulations on Title IX. The Democrats were capable of persuading the negotiations in the final outcome to only grant the waiver authority for elementary and secondary to the Secretary at this time. Similar to my comments on the previous slide, we do believe in conversations with congressional staff that there is the possibility that that could be opened up further in the next iteration of phase 4. Again, because while there certainly are a number of the areas where opportunities for relief have already been at the higher ed level have already been put in to the CARES Act, we well know that there are a number of other issues that are going to need additional guidance and potentially additional waivers. To that end, one such recognition comes not only from our community, but also from ACE and NICU and the other communities who sent a letter to the Department of Education acknowledging that the issues with regard to lost revenues across the entire spectrum of institutions of higher education is likely to cause significant concerns with regard to the financial responsibility standards, and in particular, the calculation of the composite score ratio. They, in terms related to this, put forward a letter back on March 23rd that specifically talked about this in the context of concerns with regard to distance education and the limits placed under the SAR, which is the state reciprocity agreements under SARA that look to and provide for the combination of a single set of standards instead of institutions that provide online education having to meet the individual state requirements of each state where a student may reside that is participating in online education at their state. Midway through this, they talk about the fact that that guidance is prohibitive if, in fact, the ratio for the composite score right here goes under 1%, 1.0, that they would automatically be disqualified from continuing to provide online education. So you can see that there are a number of ripple effects, if you will, that go along with even the very thoughtful and supportive provisions that are included in the CARES Act. These are things that certainly We have our own list and are continuing to develop lists to provide not only to the department, but back to Congress. I can tell you that the congressional staff have requested and given indications to CSPEN that it would be, and they would be receptive to, the continuation of efforts to share with them some of those concerns. From our vantage point and perspective, that would certainly include CSR, meaning the composite score ratio. It would also include considerable discussions around 90-10. Back to NICU and ACE, what they actually asked for as a result of their concerns is a 3-year waiver of the utilization of composite score ratios for their community. So you can see how seriously they take it if they're asking for a 3-year waiver. They certainly are showing that while the implications are now, the ripple effects and the potential impact of even some of the benefits now that won't be addressed until the out years are as a result of, as we well know, a number of regulations where the reporting being, again, 1 to 2 years in arrears won't come home to roost until a later date. Certainly things with regard to loan repayment rates and how all of issues with regard to cohort default rates play out is another area where this will happen. More immediately are issues related, again, under financial responsibility and administrative capability. What happens with regard to audits and the timelines for audits? What happens to the ability for entities to complete those for periods that have just ended, as well as for those coming up at the end of June? We hear and have seen guidance from NASPA that some extensions for 6 months have been granted. We resource those and source those on our webpage and are working to continue to move forward with that information as we go by. And that is my daughter saying hi as she goes by. Other authorities, and these are authorities once again that unlike the limits that were placed here, there were some specific waiver authorities given to certain portions of the higher education community in the CARES Act at the institutional level, not the broader opportunity for waivers at the secretarial level. And those include specifically waivers granted for HBCUs and minority serving institutions. They are granted the ability to waive the certain portions of their outcome reporting for fiscal year 2021 and still receive the grants that they're eligible for. There also a specific latitude and provided for institutions under Title III, Title V, and Title VII, both here and in another further area of the CARES Act. We'll talk about that in just a bit. Giving me a second to take a little break and grab a quick sip. I'll keep in mind to remind you that there is the ability to ask questions if you so choose. I don't see any yet, but as you continue to see this presentation, certainly we'll get to the questions here in about another 15 to 20 minutes, and I'll try and answer others that you may have that I haven't addressed thus far. Moving away from the policy side of the CARES Act, as I alluded to at the beginning when I went through the agenda, we're now transitioning into the appropriations side of the CARES Act, and specifically the Education Stabilization Fund that was included as portions of CARES Act in order to essentially recognize that, like small businesses, like all of the other industries that are having problems, that institutions of higher education we're going to have, as well as elementary and secondary institutions, we're all going to have problems with regard to the pandemic as well. And therefore, the Congress decided and made provisions in order to try and provide funding, not to cover all of the costs related to the sustainability of institutions of higher education, but with the recognition that they were trying to do their part to promote at least some and provide at least some of the financing to assist with that and make it so that both the institution could remain open and also so that, and you'll see specifically how much they wanted to make sure that students continue to have not only access to the resources we've already alluded to, but additional funds recognizing that cost of attendance and a number of the financial need that they have may in fact increase, not only because of loss of wages, loss of family wages, or their own wages, but also just the increased complications that are coming with everybody being sheltered at home and the inability for families and individuals to raise funds on their own. To that end, included in the over $3 billion Education Stabilization Fund were $14.25 billion directly provided for institutions of higher education. And as you can see from the language pulled directly from the statute and from the summary from the appropriators, the funds are being used directly to support student-facing issues related to concerns as a result of the coronavirus. There is specific additional information, the Title III, 5, and 7 institutions that get additional potential support that you'll see as we go through the actual language here. One note before I move forward, a number of institutions, I think, within our community, as well as other communities, were a little bit surprised at this potential support from the federal government. We at CSPEN were asked by congressional offices not to go out and talk much about it until the legislation was completed. There was several reasons for that, not the least of which was because, again, the negotiations were at the very highest levels, and as you can imagine, were very contentious on some issues, and therefore the need and the desire to protect or not give rise to negativity in the course of those discussions. There is the old saying that success has 1,000 parents, failure is an orphan, but certainly I know that a lot of the individuals that worked very hard behind the scenes to make sure that we were included, all of your national trade associations as well as others, were basically requested and given guidance to please protect the interest of the negotiations as they went forward. And as a result, in particular, our great deal of credit goes to Senator Alexander and the Republican offices who were the horse that basically continued to make sure that the deliverable from our community came forward. Those funds are broken down, the $30 billion that I alluded to are broken down into three categories. One is the Governor's Emergency Relief Fund that receives 9.8% of the funds, roughly $3 billion. The other two portions, as you might imagine, are elementary and secondary and higher education. What we will focus on here is I will briefly talk about the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund when I talk about nursing here in a few minutes. But where we're going to focus our time and attention here today, as you might imagine, is on the higher education portion of the emergency relief funds. Those funds, $14.25 billion, are very clearly delegated and targeted in terms of the way in which the statute looks to have them calculated for disbursement and delivery to institutions. Because once again, the CARES Act is focused on attempting to try and help individuals that are suffering through the pandemic that were not online to be able to convert to online. In particular, you will see that one of the first statements that the stipulations provided for was that 90% of the 14.25 billion had to be calculated based on 75% of that money coming from the calculation of full-time equivalent students who were not online in distance education prior to the start of the pandemic, with the other 25% being from full-time equivalent students who were not federal Pell Grant recipients. So the goal here was to make full-time equivalents with Pell the first section and the first tranche of where the funds are directed towards, with the back end being those that are less in need or less defined as in need students. Of the rest of the 10%, we just talked about the 90. Of the 10%, 7.5% was to go to Title III and Title V. And then last but not least, Title VII institutions were designated and delegated another 2.5% of those funds. Again, so it shows you that in the development of this, significant recognition continues always to go to minority serving institutions, historically Black colleges and universities, tribals, and other institutions that predominantly focus on the delivery of funding to at-risk students, not unlike the populations we serve, but the titles under 3, 5, and 7 are portions of the Higher Education Act that are specifically developed and derived with targeted institutions and groups in mind, whereas I think you're aware, but I'll remind you if you're not, that we're not eligible to participate and play. The use of the funds, the critical portion of this, 50% of that can be used for the purposes to cover any costs associated with the changes that the institution has to go through in order to convert to away from bricks and mortar and face-to-face to online. This is inclusive of payroll and other compensation to sustain the individuals and the processes at the institution. One specific area I will call your attention to is that the statute was very prescriptive and specific that none of these funds could be used for contractors for pre-enrollment activities. This is not funding for marketing, recruiting, and advertising. These funds are intended to once again sustain the capabilities of an institution to continue to provide education to students. And as you can see from the second half, 50% of those funds should go directly to institutions in the form of additional grant assistance provided by the institution based on the funds received to cover additional cost of attendance and the various aspects that Congress assumes the students will need more availability to funds to provide for, including but not limited to food, housing, childcare, healthcare, materials, as well as technology. Special provision, again, for those institutions that didn't meet some of the criterion, there is targeted funding up to at a minimum of $500,000 for them. And also, again, a recognition that HBCUs need to be well protected and provided for in the context of the development and the delivery of these funds. Specifically under subsection B that I didn't put in here, but will share with you, there is a directive that says that these funds should be provided to institutions of higher education in the same way in which funds are delivered under FSA. So it is the assumption and assertion that once the funds are determined by the Department of Education and are subject to be released and provided to the institutions, that we anticipate that you will likely receive those through COD. Couple of questions that I'm sure you have right off the top of the bat, or you might have in a few minutes is, okay, Tom, well, all of those funds are coming to the institution. Certainly half are going to the students themselves. How does this potentially play out as a result of the 90-10 equation, and how would these funds be calculated or determined as part of 90-10? Similarly, how might they be included and what ways in which will they be allocated for purposes, once again, of the financial responsibility criterion and your audits, and specifically things like the composite score? The short answer is we don't know. The long answer is that, once again, these are the types of issues and concerns that we are already, and I've already put into a list, and have already working with other groups in order to put together a list. CSPEN over the last 2 weeks has already convened meetings with groups of CPAs to get their assessment and analysis on what the legislation could have meant when it was still in draft form. Now having the final form, what it looks like, and is put together in questions and not only questions, but things to think of in consideration of both the short term and the long term. We've done so as well with a number of the attorneys based on their clients, not on any one client, but as a community of attorneys thinking this through to again come up with a laundry list of questions and concerns. And last but not least, we're in the process of doing the same thing with the state associations and other interested parties. All of this to inform the process going forward, both for the Department of Education as well as for Congress. What ultimately, one of the other things that happened was, while we were working on a number of those things, ACE, the American Council on Education, was spending one of their weekends last weekend putting together a list of what the potential impact by institution it might be for this information to come forward. And as you can see, and as we've shared with participants on the prior call, and if you don't have access to this information already, we would gladly share it with you. There was an article put forward by NASFA that includes all of it for those of you who are NASFA members, but the information itself breaks down by state, by institution, including for-profits, privates, and publics, the anticipated amount of funds that may come to your institution. As you can see, they look at the Pell full-time equivalent, the 75% of the 90, and the 25% of the 90 here, and the not Pell full-time equivalent amounts. If you want access to this information, recognizing that it is yet again just an estimate and not necessarily a guarantee of the exact amount that your institution will ultimately receive from the department, we would be happy to share that with you. As we will be sharing with all of the participants, some 378 of you currently on the line with a copy of the audio and this PowerPoint slide presentation after the presentation is complete. Last but not least, with regard to concluding this section, there is a report that will go to Congress. Not unlike this report, we believe that the reporting of the calculations under the students that have dropped but were eligible to retain their federal Pell Grants and loans previously are information that obviously Congress is going to be very much, the Secretary and the Department as well as Congress are going to be very much interested in to see what the true implications and what the true rollout of this is over time. While they obviously have put forward a considerable amount of financing off the books, meaning off of the balance sheets of the federal budget, they still are responsible, and certainly I think are still going to be looking very carefully at how this all rolls out and how it all moves forward. This is the list of the variables that ACE put into the aforementioned calculation list. This is one of the reasons why we're not sure if it'll exactly mirror what the ways in which the Department of Education will go about doing their calculation methodology. The question that I'm sure I'm going to receive that I'll go ahead and try and answer right now. No, I do not have an exact timeline or time frame for when the institutions will be notified by the department and receive these funds. I can tell you, I'll go ahead and do it now as opposed to at the conclusion. It is rumor mill, and I will say that just as is. It is rumored right now that while we certainly have seen and know that the department is working very diligently on putting forth a lot of information and has already done so in the form of the release of the information yesterday, we do believe and are of the understanding that there is more guidance and information that is sitting over with the Office of Management and Budget right now as part of the passbacks that are in the normal process, especially when such important and relevant information is being developed by the department, similar to the way in which they do with negotiated rulemaking and so many other forms of the guidance that they put forward. It is our understanding, and the rumors are that there is something sitting over with OMB, and therefore we may see more guidance coming out, whether that be later this week or next week. Certainly everybody is looking towards to the department to gain that information and to find out when they might have access to those funds, both for their institutional purposes, but also for the students, because once again, keep in mind all of what the CARES Act was constructed for was first and foremost with the students in mind and the desire to try and sustain their ability to sustain their education without interruption, even in these trying times. Switching to something that focuses on the institution as opposed to the students, last but certainly not least, we'll have a little bit of a conversation about the Paycheck Protection Program. Whereas the other portions that we've discussed, as I alluded to, predominantly focus on students, this particular discussion is around the primary focus of Title I, of the CARES Act, which focuses on the attempt to try and maintain and sustain the entities, whether it be small businesses, 501c3s, and you see the list of entities here, the ability to sustain as much of the employment of individuals across as many entities and organizations as possible. To do so, there have been provided the opportunity for loans up to an amount of $10 million, but based on the amount of payroll funds that, and a formula that bases it on the amount of payroll funds from your prior year. These funds will be available through, as you see here, December 31st of this year, and are intended to be utilized not only as a stimulus, but as an attempt to try and sustain, as I said multiple times before, the ability for a number of different organizations and types of entities to remain afloat as times are tough. It's important to note that if you do determine and do decide to go and seek these funds, it is through an application process that you will be potentially given the opportunity to access these funds, and you must fill out that, and you must be able to show a good faith effort on ways in which to gain access to the funds and how they're going to be utilized. And again, as you can see here, the emphasis is on maintenance of payroll, leases, utilities, and the other things that basically promote sustained operations of the institution. Moving to one final area before I open it up for questions. We've had a number of questions and concerns brought forward by our community around nursing programs. And in particular, early on, the outset of concerns around the fact that nurses in their clinical portion of their education were being sent back home or back to the institution, because as the pandemic continues to spread, the ability for the hospitals, clinics, and elsewhere to limit their staff or to do so in an attempt to protect and only have essential employees in the hospitals and in the other healthcare service providers themselves, that it meant that individuals in their clinic setting couldn't continue to matriculate through their program. Certainly a detriment to those students, especially in some cases. The hardship was, unfortunately, individuals close to a week to 2 weeks away from the ability to complete their education in that setting. Some of those were able to find creative ways with integrity to get that done. Others less capable of doing so, again, based on the guidance of the state and the information provided by a number of different resources. Nevertheless, we wanted to share with you the fact that the CARES Act does include some basic information with regard to nursing workforce. There are some changes made that portions of it read like almost a reauthorization of portions of the Public Health Service Act and issues related to the nursing corps. Others do promote the notion that the ability for education of nurses is essential. While unfortunately we had pushed forward and encouraged both a number of different committees, not only the Health Committee, but also the Ways and Means and a couple of and Commerce, to look at this as potentially something where essential services needed to be inclusive of educational programs and the nurses that are potentially capable of completing their education. They did not put that in the CARES Act. However, one thing that we are encouraging institutions to consider and to work with your state associations if you have them, or work with your state even if you don't, is there you'll recall that in addition to the $14.25 billion that there is in financing for institutions of higher education, there was also $3 billion in funding for the governors. And the governors can potentially use that money as they deem appropriate in order to provide additional funds for institutions, both of elementary and secondary and higher education. And one of the major areas that the the statute provides direction to the to the governors to consider is those areas in which there are individual programs at the higher education level that are essential to moving forward the services of protections and prevention of the COVID virus. Certainly, the ability for our nursing programs and our nursing institutions, as well as other allied health programs, I'm talking about nursing, but that is not to the detriment of you that have other forms of programs within allied health that could be deemed essential as well. What we're saying here and suggesting is that you should work through your state association, through your other entities and individuals to see whether or not you can persuade the governor to use a portion of the $3 billion across the nation, divided up amongst all of the governors proportionately, to potentially have access for allied health related programs and the like. With that, I'm going to take another sip and offer up the opportunity for chat or questions. We have about another 20 minutes or so to share. If you have any questions or any additional comments, please look to the question and answer portions and the drop down. And if you put the questions in there, I have the ability to review them and I will do my best to answer them. If not, and if you need to hop off of the line before we conclude the Q&A, we do want to thank you for participating in today's conference. Before I get off, the things that I promised you in terms of next steps, we do anticipate that the department will be putting forth guidance as soon as they possibly can. Again, the rumors are over at OMB could be here by even the end of this week or next week. With regard to additional information from Congress, we are looking at the potential for phase 4 when Congress gets back in the end of April, beginning of May. It has already been discussed openly and widely that the major focus of that form of financing and the major target of those negotiations are more likely to be infrastructure, but direct conversations with staff indicate that there could be a technical corrections or the realization that there needs to be modifications based on what they did in phase 3 to be brought forward and to at least be considered. So we will be working, we CSPEN, and I'm sure others will be working throughout the entire month of April to put those together, to bring them forward, to share them with you so you can share them with your elected officials and also with other concerned parties in an attempt to once again monitor and be a part of influencing the ways in which the full higher education community, including our sector, continues to be as well represented as we were in the development of the CARES Act. Last but certainly not least, it does appear that the Senate is continuing to work on the Higher Education Act and is looking to potentially drop legislation at the end of the month of April and mark it up in May. You'll recall from any of those of you who are normal and regulars on the CSPEN email blast, the Tom bombs as they're affectionately called by some, that we had reported that the Senate were looking to do so in the month of March, but certainly that was prior to, that was our reporting in February, right before the onset of the pandemic. And certainly we all know what we've been tested with and challenged with across the board, no pun intended, throughout the entire month of March. And certainly as things have been put forward by the CDC and the president through the month of April. But we will continue to monitor and share information on that as well. The one last thing that I'll provide by way of next steps is we will continue to probably have at least one or more of these webinars weekly throughout the month of April, once again continuing just to try and share additional guidance and information as it comes out. We may do 2 next week. We're unsure, the board, and we have to sit down and determine how many and how frequently it is in your interest. If you have comments on that, please share them. And we also want to advise you that today in the Federal Register, the Department of Education also published a notice of proposed rulemaking. If like we didn't have anything else to do, the second of the 4 packets of information as a result of the Accreditation and Innovation Federal Negotiated Rulemaking in 2018 and 2019. We have the first set of the final regs of that the department published last November 1st and go into effect this July 1st. The second facet of those more on distance education and innovation, building on the portions that were in the accreditation and distance education prior package are now available for comment. I haven't had a chance to look at what the deadline for those submissions are, but we will be sharing additional information in terms of our review and analysis of that particular package in the NPRM and recommendations as we construct CSPEN's comment back to the Secretary and the department, and encourage you to do likewise. With that, I will see if we have any questions and go from there. Tom, is there any time frame by which a school must spend the 1804 funds? Very good question. I don't know the answer to that. I do believe there is portions of the guidance that talks to the time frame. I believe I don't know. I won't say because I'm not sure. I will get the answer to that, specifically the 50% for emergency relief for the students. Obviously, I think that a lot of that is focused on those that are in distress. So the more you can be working towards making sure that the funds are actually received by the students and are apportioned out to the students that are most in need, obviously that will play into a lot of those questions. Hold on a second as I consolidate. Oh gosh, there's a bunch of them. So give me a few minutes to scroll back up to the top, and I'll try and go from there. Oh man, you guys got a lot of questions. How does the DOE emergency fund affect the 90-10? Again, here is some of our initial thought process on this. We're not sure whether it does or doesn't affect the 90-10 calculation. Here's why I could make the case that it does. It is federal funds. It is money in the form of aid, half of which goes to students, similar to federal student financial aid, half of it going to the institution, all of it coming through the same delivery mechanism as federal student financial aid. I could see some of our detractors wanting to make the case that all of that money should count as the same as Title IV money because it's coming through the same pipeline. And certainly at least half of it is going and is directed and mandated to go to students. So you have to, arguably that is money that is federal dollars going to the institution, through the institution to students, the other half to the institution. How are we going to look at that, and how is it going to be either contemplated on the books or off the books? One of the ones that remains to be seen. Next question. Is it true that if you don't use it, you lose it? My understanding is, once again, that yes, if you don't use it, you lose it. There are provisos for the governor's program where if the governors don't use their full allotment, those funds are recollected at the end of the year, if I'm not mistaken, by the department, and the governor has to send them back. And keep in mind that the governors have to apply to get them in the first place. But if they get them and they don't utilize them, they go back to the department, who then has the capability to redistribute those funds at a later time to those governors and those states that are utilizing or have utilized their full amount of funds. It doesn't have that specific language in the higher education portion, so I'm making a little bit of a leap or an assumption that that would be the case. How can you obtain a copy of the slides? As promised, I will be providing everybody that is a participant with copies of the slides at the conclusion of this, along with the audio, and it will be warehoused and archived on the CSPEN website for you to be able to review once again at your leisure. Next question. A school will have to report how much they are not sending back in refunds due on COVID. Yes, under the student benefits and the way in which this is constructed, if a student withdraws and it is for reasons related to COVID, then they are eligible for the payment period or period of enrollment. And again, people might ask, well, for how long? I would venture to say for the same period of between March 31st and September 30th, which is what the freeze is for the loans and a number of these other provisions. So this could extend, and I believe will extend, to new enrollments for periods and payment periods to come. But what you have to do is the student would be eligible still to retain the money. And again, that becomes a question because the student should know at that point that you're all online, depending on when you started the enrollment. So they should know ahead of time whether or not, or have a better indication of whether or not they want to remain enrolled and can hack it in an online environment as opposed to a bricks and mortar. But again, if they drop out, you still could make the case, and the student could certainly show that the reason they dropped out was because of their desire not to, or their inability not to be able to handle or want to handle an online environment. Nevertheless, you have to do the calculation so that you can keep track of and share with the department so they can keep track of the amounts of those funds that continued to go out even though the student didn't complete the period. Next question. Would you be willing to share a replay of this webinar? Again, yes, all of this will be archived and available for any and all to review at their leisure. Does the opportunity for the borrower relief include plus loans? Unfortunately, as I said before, no. Thanks for this presentation. We are clock hour school, and our term is defined by the program, which is 780 clock hours for a full-time program. If a student in the second payment period requires to be completed 390 clock hours due to a temporary closure, we only completed. I'm going to deal with this one offline because it's pretty specific, and I want to make sure of all the details before I respond. So hang in there, Wendy. I will respond to you at a later point in time directly. And thank you for your email so I can do so. If a student continues to pay their loans, will the payments go 100% to principal? Very good question. The answer is no. What the guidance put forward by the Department of Education very clearly states is that the money that you can still make payments, individuals still have the capability to do so, and that money will be applied first to pay down any accrued interest and then to the principal. Only at the point where accrued interest is paid in full will the individuals pay towards principal. But nevertheless, they're still working towards paying down their loans. And again, if individuals are making payments or those employers are making payments on their behalf, all of that is ultimately driving down the overall cost and the overall amount of the borrowing and the debt obligation of the individual. So it's all for the better if, in fact, individuals can do that. One of the other things I probably didn't stress enough that I will do now just as it comes about, all of the forms of direct repayment or seizure options that are currently out there, wage garnishment, the ability of the IRS to seize an individual's tax refund, or those various methodologies are postponed through this period as well. It says very clearly in the guidance that the department has put forward and updated that individuals who are in the process of, or that have had wage garnishment or had their IRS take their tax money, they have the right and the capability to go back and seek the opportunity for those funds to be given to them. So a number of the methodologies that have been used in the past to gain portions of repayments are going away, but Congress in its thought process looks as it is there are 6 months that the federal government's paying for anyway. Students should be able to have those funds that they were eligible for otherwise in this time of depressed economic circumstances and the need to continue to try and protect potentially their future. Understand that Parent Plus loans are not included currently, but are Graduate Plus loans included in the forbearance and temporary suspension of payments? No, is the answer to that. I will make absolutely certain, but I'm pretty confident that is not the case. My understanding of the law regarding LOAs that students does not require the student to return at the same point in the academic program that the student began the LOA if the student returns within the same semester or equivalent. That is not my understanding. You must, and again, I am not the biggest FSA guru, so I will get back to you on this, but my understanding is, and it was touched upon specifically in the department's guidance on March 5th, that in fact, I have that available. Give me a second and maybe we can work this through together. Was in the initial guidance, sorry, so I don't have that up on my computer at the moment. I had the fact sheet. But no, my understanding is that there are ways in which you can come back in the same period for other purposes, but you have to try and start at the point at which you picked up. I will get further clarification on that and respond in greater detail. And again, where can we get a copy of this presentation? On the CSPEN website. And again, we will share it with you if you request it. If an institution has a program that normally would have a maximum LOA period of less than 180 days, 7-month program, does the 180-day LOA apply under COVID? If you have less than, if your policy is less than, you go by your policy, but you could still go up to the 180 days without having to allow them to withdraw based on the statute and the regulations. Anything over 180 days and the individual would have to be withdrawn. Again, with more guidance from the department available for you to review on their website from the March 5th and March 20th information. Has there been any discussion around institutions with standby LC outstanding? It seems to me that releasing SB and LCs or reducing them will free up liquidity. I'll have to look at this one and actually talk with some of the CPAs. Probably not the one best equipped to answer that question, but I promise you I'll get back to you. My apologies if you already mentioned this, but is this video available? Yes. Do you have any indication of whether there is any application process for the emergency fund? No, the emergency fund is calculated by the secretary in the department, and the funds will be delivered and dispersed to you by the department. Yes, there is an application process for the payroll protection portions of, and that information is already out and available throughout the country. We will put it on our COVID portion of CSPEN's website, and I will share it with you directly if you want it. One of the other questions that I've heard on more than one occasion is, Tom, are we eligible or capable of receiving funds under the Higher Education Stabilization Emergency Relief Fund, as well as through the small business? The answer to that is yes. They are two separate and finite different forms of revenue stream. The governor's is a third. If you would look to pursue that, again, with the recognition that you would be going through a process of trying to work within your state and with the governor as they determine where they're going to utilize their funds to be able to be eligible for an apportionment of whatever they come forward with. How will the use of the funds be audited on the back end? Is it a program where you have to return the money if you don't use it? In terms of audited on the back end, I do believe that certainly there are going to be reporting mechanisms associated with these funds. The department has yet to, and nor is there anything specifically in the guidance under the CARES Act that establishes the devil of those details. I concur with you in asking the question that there certainly are going to be the responsibilities and the devil of those details to come. I do not know exactly when. And again, with regard to, do you have to return the funds if you don't use them? This is an assumption, not a guarantee. I haven't seen it in writing anywhere, so not sourceable at this time, but I believe that if it is similar to what they do and what they call for in the governor's program, that yes, if you don't utilize all the funds, you would potentially have to give them back. What I'm concerned about, and again, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, this is literally extemporaneous. What I'm concerned about is if you were returning funds, what would be the circumstances under which you wouldn't continue to try and utilize those to help benefit your students? Being somewhat of a contrarian, would people come and say, you got these monies, why didn't you fully utilize them? Even if you didn't need them for your institution as an entity, why didn't you continue to utilize them for the students? Again, I'm just speaking off the cuff, but just the thought just occurred to me, and again, I have no filter. Many institutions with residence halls are making decisions to refund a portion of their spring housing charge for students who choose to or were required to leave the hall and return home. Can institutions use any portion of the higher education fund to assist in covering the housing refunds? If so, would you recommend that this be done in the form of a housing grants that reduce the housing charges? Very good question. There's nothing that I have read that would preclude these funds from being utilized in that manner. Don't know definitively, but my initial gut read is that there's nothing that would prevent them from doing so. For relief fund, it says 50% could go to the student in terms for technology. Would it be okay for the institution to allocate 100% of the funds to rapidly propping up the online delivering technology for students' use? No. The funds, 50% of the funds need to go to disbursements to the students. Utilizing 100% of it for purposes of putting the infrastructure in place for your institution would go against the directives in terms of the fact that half of the money has to be distributed to the students. From the allocated funds being delivered to the institution, the 50% of the students, how can they use these funds? Can it be converted to SEOG or institutional scholarships? Is the portion of the grants allowing us to award more within one academic year per limit for Pell? All good questions that they haven't provided guidance on yet, but that I anticipate a number of these are part of the next round of FAQs or information that the department is working very vigorously and diligently on right now. I know that they have a lot that they have been contemplating with regard to these deliverables and how to make all of the proverbial trains run on time with this. Not only the institutional side, as you can see, while they've gotten information out for borrowers, for students, for servicers and the like with regard to the loan programs, I do believe that you're going to continue to see guidance in the form of what is most imperative and most directed to the students coming out first. Again, the major driver of this from congressional's aspect, and therefore I would think from the administration's aspect, once again, is the protection and the preservation of the students' ability to continue education. So that is first and foremost in their minds, should be first and foremost in ours, even as we continue to and strive. And that is not to denigrate yet again the questions and legitimate needs from you as an institution and as a business, but in the pecking order, you can see and imagine that that will continue to be the first driver for the department as well. How do the funds available for institution support distributed to the colleges? Once again, the statute is very directly says that it should be delivered to the institutions in exactly the same way as federal student financial aid. We assume that that means that it will be through COD. I don't know of any other delivery mechanism that you receive your FSA funds, so the assumption is that it will be that way. Do you have an exact calculation of education's stabilization amount? No. The only information that we have is the information that I've shared with regard to the fund, with regard to ACE's opportunities to do an initial assumption and preliminary analysis. That's the only information that's out there thus far. How they got to the numbers, once again, is included on a specific slide. The variables that they utilized and the report where they got the information from was directly from the department's website, and if I'm not mistaken, National Center for Education Statistics and the iPads and other data. Can you use the stabilization funds for operating expenses if you are not converting to online? Good question. The funds are being given to institutions for both parts. I think the answer is yes. Once again, half of the money would still need to go to the students. The other half that you are keeping could be for other reasons. Again, keeping the operations of the entity, the institution open, I think is equally a component of it. Congress did contemplate, though, that a lot of institutions were going to have to be converting. So that's where I think that directive language in the statute came from. But I don't see anything that would preclude you from not using the money for that purposes. I would question how you're capable of continuing to offer your programs right now, given the fact that a number of states have shelter in place, a number of governors have, and more putting those requirements in place. And most institutions and students that I'm aware of have had to convert to the online methodology. Take offline if you choose to share with me the circumstances of how you might be continuing to do education in a real world environment, especially given the limitations on number of individuals in a close proximity and the very, very clear guidance of the CDC, the president, and others with regard to social distancing. Again, when do the schools and students expect to receive the emergency funding? I'm not exactly sure. That is subject to the department's capabilities. And so therefore, stay tuned. If you closed your school due to state requirements, are you required to put all enrolled students on a leave of absence? I'm not sure. There is language back in the March 5th and March 20th information that speaks to some of that, but I don't recollect the appropriate answer right off the top of my head. So again, I commit to you that I will put all these questions in a document the same way we did with the first set of questions, and we'll then provide additional follow-up to everybody. And the last question, believe it or not, sorry to ask for a repeat, but want to ensure that I follow correctly. Is it CSPEN's interpretation that proprietary institutions are eligible for the campus-based non-federal matching waiver? Yes. Again, we have very specific language that ties to the statute under section 443C3 that provides the exact guidance explaining that the private for-profit organization is the matching component for purposes of the match to the work-study funds, and that is what is being alluded to with the exemption there. It is basically stating that the employers are not exempt from having to do their non-federal matching share under the requirement as is provided under work-study. How they're going to do that if they're not open or if they're having problems themselves becomes another question. With that, we are a few minutes over our hour and a half time frame, but I want to thank all of you for participating in today's call. We do hope that you found it helpful. Please share with us any questions or continued things that you would like to see us provide in the way of electronic announcements via the email or in future webinars. We appreciate and understand that all of you are out there just like the department and just like us, flying without a net and trying to do the best you can to interpret and do what is necessary to be in compliance, while at the same time doing everything that you can for the betterment of your students. We applaud you for that. We hope that you will continue to be able to do so with the help of this guidance and more to come. We will continue to give you updates as new information comes out through breaking news email blasts, especially if any more guidance comes from the department or elsewhere this week. And we'll look to share more information with you again next week. Once again, thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for more information to follow, and have a great day and a great weekend.